The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that only exists in places where power lives. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking a city that never stopped moving. Inside, everything was polished, the table, the suits, the smiles that weren't real. At the far end of the room, a black teenage girl stood alone, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She didn't look lost, she didn't look afraid, but she didn't look like she belonged there either, at least not to them. Then the laugh came. Sharp, confident, cruel. It belonged to Richard Harlan, the millionaire everyone listened to. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning her from head to toe like she was a bad joke someone had dragged into a serious meeting. "An heiress," he said, loud enough for the whole room. "You're telling us this child owns more of this company than any of us." A few executives chuckled. Others avoided eye contact. No one defended her. The girl didn't flinch. She took one slow breath and said, quietly but clearly, "I'm not here for attention. I'm here for what belongs to my family." That did it. The laughter grew louder. Richard shook his head, smiling as if he'd already won. "Do you have any idea where you are?" he asked. "This isn't a classroom, this isn't some charity office, this is a boardroom." Security shifted near the door. The girl reached into her bag and pulled out a thin, worn envelope, not dramatic, not flashy. Just paper, just truth. She placed it on the table. "I'm asking you to verify it," she said. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "We've seen enough." But then something unexpected happened. The board secretary's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. Her smile disappeared. Her fingers tightened around the phone as she slowly looked up, not at the girl, but at Richard. The room felt different now. Heavy, uncertain. No one laughed. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, it became clear. What they didn't know was about to change everything. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, and long before she ever stepped into that boardroom, she had learned a painful truth about the world. People decide who you are before you ever speak. She learned it in classrooms where teachers assumed she needed extra help she never asked for. She learned it in stores where security followed her through every aisle. She learned it every time adults spoke around her instead of to her. Aaliyah was 17, black, and raised in a small apartment on the edge of the city by her grandmother, Ruth Carter, a woman with tired hands, sharp wisdom, and a past she rarely spoke about. They didn't have much, but Ruth raised her with something more valuable than money: dignity. "Never beg for respect," her grandmother used to say. "If they don't give it to you, stand anyway." Aaliyah's mother, Naomi Carter, had died when she was young. All Aaliyah had left of her were photographs, a few letters, and a silence that felt heavier than grief. Naomi had been brilliant, reserved, and deeply cautious, especially whenever the subject of her own family came up. There were moments late at night when Naomi would stare out the window and say things that never fully made sense. "One day," she once whispered, "you'll have to stand where they don't expect you." Aaliyah didn't understand those words then. She did now. Everything changed 3 months earlier, the day Ruth collapsed in their kitchen. While sorting through her grandmother's belongings at the hospital, Aaliyah found a locked metal box hidden beneath old documents. Inside were birth records, legal papers, and a name that sent her heart racing: Carter Holdings Group, one of the most powerful investment firms in the region. At first, she thought it was a mistake. But it was. The documents told a story no one had ever taught her in school, about a black founder erased from his own company, about shares hidden, transferred, buried under legal language designed to make sure they were never reclaimed. And at the center of it all was her mother's name, and now hers. Aaliyah didn't celebrate, she didn't tell anyone. She felt fear before anything else. Because power doesn't just bring privilege, it brings enemies. The world she was stepping into was not built for someone like her. That world belonged to men like Richard Harlan. Richard was everything Aaliyah was not allowed to be: loud, confident, unquestioned. A self-made millionaire who loved to tell his story at charity dinners and interviews. He spoke often about discipline, merit, and how anyone can make it if they work hard enough. What he never mentioned was how he'd inherited access before he ever earned success. Richard had been sitting on the board of Carter Holdings for over a decade, slowly tightening his grip, reshaping the company in his own image. To him, the firm was a machine, and machines didn't have ghosts. When Aaliyah walked into the building that morning, she felt every eye on her. The receptionist asked who she was visiting twice. Security requested her ID, politely but firmly. Everyone else passed by without a second glance, assuming she was someone's assistant, someone's daughter, someone who didn't matter. No one imagined she was there to challenge the room itself. Inside the boardroom sat people who had never been questioned in their lives, lawyers with expensive watches, executives who spoke in percentages instead of names, faces that reflected generations of comfort. There was only one person in that room who noticed Aaliyah without judgment. Elias Monroe, a senior legal advisor nearing retirement, a black man with silver hair and observant eyes. When he heard her last name, something in him paused, not disbelief, recognition. He didn't interrupt, he didn't defend her, he waited. Because men like Elias had learned something important over time. Truth doesn't need volume, it needs patience. Aaliyah stood in that room carrying more than documents. She carried her mother's silence, her grandmother's warnings, generations of being overlooked, underestimated, and erased. She wasn't there to embarrass anyone. She wasn't there to take revenge. She was there because history had finally caught up. And whether the room accepted it or not, her presence was already a disruption. The tension wasn't loud yet, but it was alive. The meeting was supposed to start without her. That much was clear from the way the board chair glanced at his watch, cleared his throat, and began reviewing agenda points as if Aaliyah Carter were nothing more than a shadow standing near the wall. Quarterly profits, market projections, legal updates. Words floated through the room like they mattered more than people ever did. Aaliyah listened quietly, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Every instinct in her body told her this was the moment she would be erased again, politely, professionally, with a smile that said this isn't personal. Richard Harlan finally noticed her when the chair paused. "And before we continue," the chair said carefully, "we have an unexpected visitor." Richard turned. His eyes narrowed not with curiosity, but annoyance, the kind reserved for interruptions that don't belong. "Yes," he said. Aaliyah stepped forward. Each footstep echoed louder than it should have on the marble floor. "My name is Aaliyah Carter," she said. "I'm here regarding ownership verification." There it was, the sentence that shifted the air. Richard blinked once, then let out a short laugh as if he'd misheard. "Ownership," he repeated. "Of what exactly?" "Of this company," Aaliyah said. The pause that followed was not empty, it was loaded. A few people leaned back in their chairs. One lawyer exchanged a glance with another. Someone coughed. Then Richard laughed again, this time longer. "That's funny," he said. "Really funny." No one joined in this time, but no one stopped him either. The chair tried to intervene. "Mr. Harlan, let's—" Richard raised a hand, still smiling, eyes never leaving Aaliyah. "Let me handle this," he said. Then to her, "Young lady, do you know how many people come into this building every year claiming they're owed something?" Aaliyah nodded once. "I imagine a lot." "Exactly," Richard said. "And do you know how many of them actually are?" He didn't wait for her answer. "None." Aaliyah reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, as if she were aware that any sudden movement might be misunderstood. She pulled out the envelope, thin, creased, held together at the corners with age. "This contains my mother's estate documents," she said, "and a trust record naming me as beneficiary." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "You expect us to stop a board meeting for a teenager with paperwork?" "I expect you to verify it," Aaliyah replied. Her voice never rose. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Richard leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the table. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Who told you this story? A lawyer, a relative, someone trying to use you?" "No one," Aaliyah said. "I found the documents myself." That earned another laugh, sharper this time. "Of course you did." One of the executives finally spoke. "Security can escort her." "No," Elias Monroe said calmly. Every head turned. Elias hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Years in rooms like this had taught him that quiet confidence carried more weight than volume. "Before we remove anyone," Elias continued, "we should hear what she's claiming." Richard frowned. Elias, with all due respect, this is ridiculous. Perhaps, Elias said, or perhaps it's overdue. Aaliyah placed the envelope on the table. The sound it made was soft, but the effect was not. A junior attorney reached for it, hesitated, then opened it. As pages flipped, the room grew tense in a way that had nothing to do with numbers or profits. Richard watched closely now. "What's the last name again?" one lawyer asked. "Carter," Aaliyah said. Elias' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Carter," he repeated. Richard scoffed. "You mean like the old Carter? That was generations ago." "History doesn't expire," Aaliyah replied. That was the moment Richard's smile faded. "Careful," he said. "You're speaking to people who built this company." Aaliyah met his gaze. "No," she said, "you're speaking for people who took it." The room went still. Too still. The chair cleared his throat again. "We'll need time to review these materials." Richard stood abruptly. "There's nothing to review," he snapped. "This is a distraction." Aaliyah didn't move. "I'm not leaving," she said. Security stepped closer. Her heart pounded now not from fear, but from the weight of everything she carried into that room. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, "Stand anyway." Elias looked at the documents again. Then he looked at Richard. "Run the verification," he said. Richard's eyes hardened. And for the first time since Aaliyah walked into that building, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in beneath his confidence. Uncertainty. The decision to run the verification did not come with applause. It came with resistance. Richard Harlan straightened his jacket, forcing a calm he no longer fully felt. "This is getting out of hand," he said, glancing around the room as if expecting agreement. "We are not obligated to indulge every dramatic claim that walks through those doors." No one answered him. That silence irritated him more than open defiance ever could. The board chair finally spoke. "We'll take a short recess. Legal will review the documents. Security will remain nearby." Aaliyah heard the unspoken message. "You are tolerated, not welcomed." She was escorted, not pushed, but guided, into a smaller conference room down the hall. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded final. Inside, the room was colder. No windows, no view of the city, just a long table and chairs that felt too big for her body. She sat anyway. Alone, the adrenaline drained from her veins, leaving behind the ache she had been holding back since morning. Her hands trembled for the first time. She pressed them together, grounding herself. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, the chipped mug, the smell of tea, the safety of being unseen. "You could have stayed small," a voice whispered in her mind. "You chose this." Down the hall in the main boardroom, the tone had shifted completely. The junior attorney laid the documents out carefully now, no longer skimming, no longer dismissive. Names were checked, dates cross-referenced, signatures compared. "These are original filings," she said quietly, "not copies." Another lawyer leaned in. "The trust registration predates the restructuring." Elias Monroe remained standing, hands folded behind his back, watching not the papers, but Richard. Richard paced near the window, jaw clenched. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. "Anyone can forge documents." "Not these," the attorney replied. "They're sealed through legacy probate channels. Access alone would be unusual." Richard stopped pacing. "What are you saying?" he asked sharply. "I'm saying," she answered carefully, "that whoever prepared these knew exactly what they were doing." Elias finally spoke. "Her mother did." All eyes turned to him. Elias took a breath, the weight of memory pressing into his voice. "Naomi Carter came to this firm once, years ago, quiet, intelligent. She asked questions no one wanted to answer." Richard's face darkened, and she was told to let the past stay buried," Elias said. "She didn't." The room grew tense. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "If this is true," he said, "then we're looking at a serious ownership issue." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. Even if there's some technical connection, she's a minor. This isn't how corporations work." Elias met his gaze steadily. "The law doesn't care how old truth is or how young it looks." Minutes stretched. In the small conference room, Aaliyah stared at the door, replaying every word she had said, every look she had received. She wondered if she'd gone too far, if this was the moment everything fell apart. Then the door opened. Elias stepped inside. His presence alone changed the air. "They're still reviewing," he said gently, "but you should know something." Aaliyah stood slowly. "What?" "You weren't wrong to come," he said, "and you weren't wrong to stay." Her throat tightened. "They don't believe me." Elias smiled faintly. "Some of them already do, they're just afraid of what belief costs." Back in the boardroom, the board secretary returned to her seat, phone still clutched in her hand. She whispered something to the chair, who stiffened slightly. "What is it?" Richard asked. "The external registry confirmed the trust," the secretary said. "They're sending documentation now." The room went quiet again. Different this time. Heavier. Richard's confidence cracked, not visibly, but enough. He adjusted his tie, suddenly aware of how tight it felt. "That doesn't mean control," he said quickly. "It means discussion." The chair nodded slowly. "It means we have to proceed formally." Elias returned with Aaliyah. Every eye turned toward her. She walked back into the boardroom, not rushing, not hesitating. Her heart was still racing, but her steps were steady. Richard watched her now the way predators watch storms, unable to stop them, unable to ignore them. The chair gestured for her to sit. "For now," he said. She took a seat near the end of the table. Not the head. Not yet. But she was at the table. And that alone changed everything. The board chair cleared his throat. "Until verification concludes, no further decisions will be made." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, then forced a thin smile. "This isn't over," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. Aaliyah met his gaze. "I know," she said. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Richard understood something he had never considered before. This girl was not asking for permission. She was claiming what had always been hers. The days that followed did not slow down, they tightened. What had started as a disruption became an investigation, and what had been dismissed as an inconvenience now hovered over Carter Holdings like a storm cloud no one could outrun. Meetings were postponed. Calls were taken behind closed doors. Legal teams worked late into the night, combing through decades of transactions that had never been meant to be revisited. Aaliyah was told to wait. Not dismissed, not removed, just delayed. She sat in a private waiting room overlooking the city, watching traffic crawl beneath her like veins pulsing through concrete. The view was beautiful, but it felt distant, like something she was allowed to see, but not touch. Every hour someone new entered the room. A lawyer, an assistant, a compliance officer, each one polite, each one cautious, no one rude anymore. That alone told her something had changed. Still, no one spoke plainly. They asked questions instead. About her mother. About her grandmother. About when she first learned the truth. Aaliyah answered carefully, honestly. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't soften anything either. She spoke the way her grandmother had taught her, say only what you can stand on. Between interviews, she sat alone, hands folded in her lap, listening to the building hum. For the first time since she walked through those doors, the fear was not about being thrown out. It was about what would happen if she stayed. Down the hall, Richard Harlan was unraveling, quietly, strategically, but undeniably. He stood near the window of the executive lounge, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. He called old contacts, former partners, lawyers who owed him favors. "This needs to be contained," he said. "We're talking about ancient history." On the other end of the line, someone responded in a tone he didn't like, cautious, measured. That tone followed him everywhere now. In the boardroom, documents spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to finish. The deeper legal team dug, the more uncomfortable the story became. Original stock allocations that didn't align. Transfers approved under pressure. Signatures that belonged to people long dead or silenced. Elias Monroe sat at the far end of the table, watching it all with a heaviness he hadn't felt in years. He remembered when Carter Holdings was something else entirely, before the polish, before the rebranding, before certain names disappeared from plaques and press releases. He remembered the founder, a black man with vision and restraint, who believed legacy meant responsibility, not dominance. Elias had stayed quiet back then. He told himself it wasn't his fight, that the system was bigger than him. Now, watching Aaliyah's name surface again and again in legal records, he felt the weight of that silence. And this time, he didn't intend to carry it alone. A junior attorney broke the quiet. "If this trust is upheld, she doesn't just have a claim," she said. "She has leverage." Richard scoffed. "She's a child." "She's a beneficiary," the attorney replied, "and beneficiaries don't need permission to exist." Richard's jaw tightened. "She doesn't understand this world," he said. "She'll fold." Elias looked up. "You're underestimating her." Richard turned sharply. "You don't know her." Elias met his gaze evenly. "I know people who grow up being ignored learn how to listen, and people who listen learn everything." The room fell quiet again. Meanwhile, whispers had begun spreading beyond the boardroom. Staff noticed unusual meetings. Executives stopped making eye contact. Rumors slipped through emails and hushed hallway conversations. Something was happening, and it involved the girl no one could stop talking about. Aaliyah felt the shift too. When she walked through the building now, people noticed her not with suspicion but with curiosity. Some nodded, some smiled cautiously. A few looked away, unsure how to treat her. Power, she realized, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly and made everyone nervous. One afternoon, Elias asked to speak with her privately. They sat across from each other in a small office filled with old books and framed certificates. The kind of room that belonged to someone who had seen enough to stop proving anything. "I want to tell you something," he said. Aaliyah nodded. "Your mother came here once," Elias continued. "She wasn't asking for control, she was asking for acknowledgement." Aaliyah swallowed. Did she get it? "No," Elias said softly, "but she planted something." Aaliyah looked down at her hands. "I didn't come here to punish anyone." Elias smiled gently. "That's how I know you're ready." Outside that office, Richard watched from a distance, pretending to check his phone. He didn't trust Elias anymore. He didn't trust the board. And for the first time in years, he didn't trust the ground beneath his feet. The truth was surfacing, slowly, relentlessly. And no amount of money could stop it once it had been named. The rising action had begun. And the room, the system, the people inside it were already changing. As the investigation deepened, the building itself seemed to change its posture. Carter Holdings had always moved with confidence, fast elevators, decisive footsteps, voices that never questioned direction. Now everything slowed. People paused before speaking. Doors closed more often. Meetings ended without conclusions. Uncertainty had entered the walls. Aaliyah felt it most in the way people looked at her now. Not dismissive, not mocking, measuring. She was no longer invisible, and that came with its own weight. Every document review brought another piece of history into the light. Not just legal wrongdoing, but moral failure. The original founder's name had been scrubbed from company lore, replaced with a sanitized narrative that credited collective effort instead of individual vision. Shares that should have protected his descendants had been fragmented, hidden behind shell agreements designed to confuse rather than clarify. This wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Elias sat through hours of review sessions, his silence growing heavier with each revelation. He saw his younger self reflected in the excuses around the table. It was a different time. The rules were unclear. We didn't know. He knew those lies well. And for the first time in decades, he spoke against them. "We knew," Elias said during one tense session. "We just benefited from not asking." The room went quiet. Richard shifted in his seat, irritation barely contained. "You're acting like we're criminals." Elias turned to him. "No, I'm acting like we're accountable." That word, accountable, landed harder than any accusation. Behind the scenes, Richard's influence began to fracture. Calls went unanswered. Allies hesitated. Lawyers advised caution instead of aggression. The confidence he once wore like armor now felt thin. He had built his identity on being untouchable. Now a teenager threatened to dismantle that illusion, not with force but with truth. Richard tried a different approach. He requested a private conversation with Aaliyah. The meeting took place in a small executive lounge, neutral ground. No lawyers, no board members, just the two of them seated across from each other. "You're smart," Richard began, voice controlled. "Smarter than most people your age." Aaliyah listened without responding. "This process," he continued, "it's going to get ugly, public, messy. I'm trying to spare you that." "I didn't ask for sparing," Aaliyah said calmly. Richard leaned forward. "You could walk away with a generous settlement, enough to change your life." Aaliyah met his eyes. "My life was already changed before I came here." Richard frowned. "You don't understand what you're risking." She nodded. "I do. That's why I'm still here." The conversation ended without agreement. And with it, Richard's last illusion of control. Not all resistance was loud. Some board members struggled quietly. They weren't villains, just beneficiaries of comfort. People who had never asked where their privilege came from because it had always been there. One woman spoke privately to Elias. "If this goes public, everything changes." Elias nodded. "That's usually what truth does." Meanwhile, Aaliyah faced her own internal battle. At night, alone in the guest apartment arranged by the company, she stared at the ceiling, replaying memories of her mother, wondering if she was strong enough to finish what Naomi had started. There was a moment, brief, dangerous, when doubt crept in. What if I don't belong here? But then she remembered every door that had been closed to her without explanation, every assumption, every quiet dismissal. This wasn't about belonging. It was about correction. The quiet reflection came one evening when Elias handed her a framed photograph recovered from the archives. It showed the original founder standing in front of the first office building, proud, reserved, undeniable. "He wanted this company to outlive him," Elias said. "He didn't expect it to forget him." Aaliyah held the frame carefully. "I won't let that happen again," she said. The next morning, the board received the final audit summary. Everything was confirmed. The trust was valid. The shares were hers. The control she represented was real. There was no legal escape left, only moral reckoning. As the board scheduled the decisive meeting, tension settled over the company like held breath. Employees sensed the moment approaching. History was about to be rewritten, not erased, but restored. Richard stood alone in his office, staring at the city he once believed he ruled. For the first time, the height felt meaningless. Across the building, Aaliyah walked toward the boardroom again, not as an interruption, not as a visitor, but as an inevitable presence. The storm had fully formed, and the climax was waiting. The boardroom doors closed slowly, sealing in decades of silence. Every seat was filled this time, not a single chair left empty. Lawyers lined one side of the room, folders stacked neatly in front of them. Board members sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes darting toward one another as if searching for reassurance that didn't exist. At the far end of the table sat Richard Harlan. For the first time since anyone could remember, he looked unsure of his reflection in the glass. And standing near the doorway was Aaliyah Carter. She wasn't asked to wait outside today. She wasn't guided to a corner. She was invited in. The board chair cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the heavy air. "This meeting is now in session. We are here to conclude the ownership verification process concerning Carter Holdings." No one interrupted. No one dared. Aaliyah took a seat, still not at the head of the table, but closer now. Close enough that the polished surface reflected her face alongside men and women who had never imagined sharing power with someone like her. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a small, nervous habit he didn't realize he'd developed. The lead attorney stood. "After a comprehensive audit," she began, "we have confirmed the validity of the Carter Family Trust. The trust predates the company's restructuring and was legally shielded through multi-generational probate channels." She paused, letting the words settle. "The beneficiary named is Aaliyah Carter." A murmur rippled through the room, not surprise, but inevitability finally spoken aloud. Richard leaned forward. "That doesn't mean control," he said quickly. "Ownership percentages matter." The attorney nodded. "They do." She flipped a page. Based on recovered records, corrected allocations, and verified transfers, Ms. Carter holds a majority controlling interest in Carter Holdings. The room went silent. Not a cough. Not a breath. Richard's face drained of color so fast it looked unreal, as if the confidence that had fueled him for years had been unplugged all at once. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked around the room, waiting for someone to challenge it. No one did. The board chair turned slowly toward Aaliyah. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice measured but respectful now, "do you acknowledge these findings?" Aaliyah stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor as she rose, the sound echoing in the stillness. She felt every eye on her, not judging now, but witnessing. "I do," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer owned her. The chair nodded. "Then, as of this moment, you are the majority shareholder of Carter Holdings." Richard pushed back from the table slightly, as if the words had physical force. "This is absurd," he said hoarsely. "She doesn't even know how this company runs." Elias Monroe spoke before anyone else could. "She knows how it was built," he said, "and how it was taken." Richard turned on him. "You stayed quiet for years." "Yes," Elias replied, "and that's why I won't now." The chair raised a hand. "Order." He looked back at Aaliyah. "As majority shareholder, you have the authority to appoint or remove board leadership." All eyes followed his gaze. Richard swallowed. The power dynamic that had ruled this room for decades cracked wide open. Aaliyah took a slow breath. In that moment, she saw her grandmother's hands folded at the kitchen table. Her mother's eyes staring out a window, holding a truth she never got to speak. The founder's photograph, proud, erased, waiting. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She spoke with calm intention. "I don't want revenge," Aaliyah said. "I want restoration." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "That's a nice word." "It's a necessary one," she replied. She turned to the board. This company was built on vision. It lost that when it chose comfort over conscience. She paused, then looked directly at Richard. "I am requesting the immediate resignation of Richard Harlan as acting chairman." The words landed like thunder. Richard stood abruptly. "You can't be serious." "I am," Aaliyah said, "effective immediately." The chair looked at Richard. "Mr. Harlan, given the circumstances, do you wish to respond?" Richard's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies who were no longer there. Slowly, painfully, he realized the truth. Power had never been loyalty. It had been convenience. He straightened his jacket one last time. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice tight. Aaliyah met his gaze evenly. "So did you." Silence followed as Richard removed his chair from the table. No applause. No insults. Just the sound of a man stepping away from something he thought he owned. The chair turned back to Aaliyah. "Ms. Carter, where would you like to sit?" For the first time, she hesitated, not out of fear but reverence. Then she walked to the head of the table. Every step felt deliberate, earned. She placed her hands lightly on the polished surface and took her seat. In that moment, the room shifted. Not because a teenager had taken control, but because history had reclaimed its place. Aaliyah looked around the table. "This company will move forward," she said, "but it will not pretend anymore." No one objected. No one laughed. The climax didn't end with shouting or chaos. It ended with something far more powerful. Truth finally seated where it belonged. The building didn't erupt after the meeting ended. There were no raised voices in the hallway, no dramatic exits, no celebration spilling into the streets below. Carter Holdings returned to its rhythm almost immediately, elevators moving, phones ringing, assistants walking with purpose. But beneath the surface, everything was different. News of the decision spread quietly at first, carried through internal memos and carefully worded legal notices. Richard Harlan's resignation was framed as a strategic transition. The language was soft, but the message was unmistakable. Power had changed hands. Aaliyah remained in the boardroom long after everyone else had left. The late afternoon sun filtered through the glass walls, casting long shadows across the table where history had finally been corrected. Ilya stood nearby, respectful, waiting. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said gently. Ilya nodded. "I know." One of her first actions wasn't public or symbolic, it was personal. She requested access to the company archives, not the curated displays in the lobby, but the records that hadn't been touched in years. Boxes were brought up from storage, dust-covered folders, old photographs, letters written in careful handwriting. She found her mother's name again and again, not as a troublemaker, not as a threat, but as someone who had tried to protect the truth quietly, patiently. Ilya arranged for the founder's name to be restored across company history, not as a footnote, not as an apology. As acknowledgement. Employees noticed the shift almost immediately. Meetings changed tone. People listened more. Decisions slowed, not from fear, but from intention. Ilya didn't pretend to be something she was. She asked questions. She learned. She surrounded herself with people who told her the truth instead of what they thought she wanted to hear. Elias became her advisor, not because he knew everything, but because he had learned from staying silent too long. Richard, meanwhile, faded from the company he once dominated. His name still carried weight in certain circles, but it no longer commanded rooms. Without the authority he had relied on, his confidence felt hollow. He watched from a distance as the company evolved, not ruined, not destroyed, but refined. And for the first time, he understood something he had never considered. Legacy wasn't about control. It was about what endured when control was gone. Ilya visited her grandmother the following weekend. Ruth sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes still sharp despite the years. Ilya didn't talk about boardrooms or votes. She just sat beside her and held her hand. "They listened," Ilya said quietly. Ruth smiled faintly. "They always do, eventually." Later, alone in her childhood bedroom, Ilya placed the founder's photograph beside one of her mother. Two lives separated by time, reunited by courage. The world outside continued moving, fast, loud, distracted. But inside Carter Holdings, something rare had happened. A system had been challenged not by force, but by dignity. A truth had survived being buried. And a young black woman had taken her place, not by asking but by standing. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that made all the difference. Some stories don't begin with power. They begin with silence. They begin with names erased from records, voices ignored in rooms where decisions are made, and people taught to believe that if something was taken long enough ago, it no longer matters. But the truth is this: time does not erase injustice. Comfort does not cancel accountability. And dignity does not need permission. Ilya Carter didn't win because she was loud. She didn't win because someone rescued her. She won because she stood where she wasn't expected and refused to move. This story isn't just about a boardroom or a company. It's about every system that counts on people staying quiet. Every door that assumes it will never be challenged. Every truth waiting for the right moment and the right courage to return. Real power isn't proven by how long you hold it. It's proven by whether it survives the truth. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight back. It's to stand firm, speak clearly, and let the truth do the rest. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's been told they don't belong. Someone who's been underestimated. Someone who's still holding a truth the world isn't ready to hear, yet. Because history doesn't disappear. It waits, and when it comes back, it comes with purpose.